Picture this outside. The desert air is a shimmering curtain of white-hot fire. The sun sits heavy in the cloudless sky over the Mojave Desert, baking the barren ground until the surface dirt reaches a blistering 155 degrees Fahrenheit. The air itself scorches your lungs at 115 degrees in the shade, if you can find any shade at all. Metal tools burn bare skin on contact. Water barrels sizzle and evaporate. Up on the surface, men are dropping from heat stroke, their tongues swollen, their minds slipping into delirium as they clutch at thin canvas tents that do nothing but trap the radiant energy like a clay pizza oven. And yet, less than 30 feet directly beneath their boots, inside a hand-carved subterranean chamber of raw volcanic rock, a solitary man sleeps soundly tucked under a thick wool blanket. Inside that stone cavern, the air is not hot. It is not even warm. It is a crisp, stable 62 degrees Fahrenheit. Consider the contrast while the surface world burns in an inferno that rivals the hottest place on Earth. This lone prospector sleeps in bone-chilling comfort, using zero electricity, zero ice, and zero modern technology, decoupled. When fellow prospectors first stumbled upon his cave entry, they called him insane. They watched him haul heavy pickaxes into the dark earth and mocked him for wasting his time digging a hole in the dirt when gold was waiting in the hills. They believed he was digging his own grave until the great heatwave struck. When they staggered toward his portal in desperation, expecting to find a suffocating, dusty furnace, they stepped through the threshold and were hit by a wall of cold, circulating air that knocked the breath right out of them. But the true secret lay deeper, that man did not discover a magical cave. He did not possess an ancient secret that defies science. What he built was a highly effective work of passive thermodynamic engineering, a subterranean sanctuary that exploited the natural thermal mass of the Earth to flatten peak summer heat waves into a perpetual 62-degree haven. But there is a catch, a deadly catch that almost no one talks about. If you try to build a shelter like this today, or if you attempt to seek refuge in a shallow earth dugout without understanding the physics of air density and gas accumulation, you are stepping into a lethal trap. Over 90% of modern off-grid cave shelter builds fail catastrophically, and many turn into silent, oxygen-starved tombs. To survive under the earth, you cannot just dig a hole. You have to understand the invisible war between thermal mass, stack effect ventilation, and carbon monoxide. To understand how this extraordinary shelter was born, we have to go back to the late 1890s to the unforgiving, sun-bleached expanse of the Mojave Desert and Death Valley. It was an era driven by desperation and the blinding promise of gold. Thousands of men flooded into the arid Southwest, hauling pickaxes, dry washers, and high hopes across hundreds of miles of cracked alkali lake beds and barren granite ridges. They were tough, hardened men, used to physical labor and brutal conditions, but nothing prepared them for the raw, unyielding ferocity of a southwestern desert summer. By 10 o'clock in the morning, the sun transforms the sky into a dome of molten brass. The wind does not bring relief. It blows across the scorching valley floor like an open blast furnace, carrying fine, razor-sharp alkaline dust that burns the eyes and parches the throat. Sweat evaporates the instant it reaches the skin, leaving a fine crust of white salt behind. Your body drains its fluid reserves faster than you can swallow water. In those early mining camps, shelter was a matter of life and death, yet almost every conventional structure built by these prospectors was a thermodynamic failure. Most men pitched standard canvas wall tents. It seemed logical at the time. Canvas was portable, cheap, and easy to set up. It provided shade from the blinding glare of the sun. But canvas holds a fatal secret. While a canvas tent blocks direct sunlight, the fabric itself absorbs immense amounts of solar radiation, heating up like an iron griddle. The air trapped beneath that thin sheet of cotton cannot circulate. The radiant heat off the fabric strikes the ground, heating the dirt floor until the entire interior turns into a suffocating pressure cooker. While the ambient air outside measured 115 degrees Fahrenheit, inside those canvas tents, temperatures routinely soared past 135 degrees. In other words, a man stepping inside his tent to escape the sun was actually stepping into an oven. Sleeping inside a canvas tent during the heat of the afternoon was practically impossible. The air was so dense with trapped thermal energy that it felt like breathing steam from a boiling kettle. Desperate for relief, some prospectors tried to build wooden shacks using rough-sawn pine or cedar boards hauled in from distant mountain sawmills. Pathways were cleared, posts were driven, and timber walls went up, but wood suffered from the same fundamental weakness. Thin wooden boards have an exceptionally low insulation value. Under the unrelenting assault of 6 continuous hours of intense desert sunlight, the wood absorbs energy until it begins radiating heat directly into the interior room. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a timber shack felt no different than a timber drying kiln. Then came the shade canopies. Men erected double-layered canvas roofs and elevated thatched brush shelters, thinking that creating a shadow gap above their living space would solve the problem. Yet, the physical reality was unforgiving. Even if you eliminate direct sunlight entirely, you are still surrounded by ambient air that is sitting at 115 degrees Fahrenheit. That hot air flows freely through open shade structures, stripping moisture from the human body and warming every physical object to match the ambient environment. You cannot shade your way out of a 115-degree ambient heat wave. When canvas failed and wooden shacks became uninhabitable, prospectors turned to the earth itself, but they did it wrong. They began digging shallow dirt trenches, 2 or 3 feet deep, and stretching canvas or pine poles across the top to create a half-dugout shelter. They believed that being near the dirt would keep them cool. Instead, they created a thermal capacitor that worked against them. A shallow layer of surface dirt, anything less than 4 or 5 feet deep, acts as a massive thermal sponge. During the daylight hours, the ground absorbs intense radiant energy from the sun. By mid-afternoon, that top layer of Earth reaches temperatures exceeding 140 to 155 degrees Fahrenheit. When you build a shallow dugout, you are surrounding yourself with earth that has spent all day storing intense surface heat. At night, when the surface air finally drops into the 70s or 80s, that shallow dirt begins releasing its stored energy straight into the dugout, turning the space into a hot, radiating heat battery long after the sun has set. Men would lie awake on their cots at midnight, drenched in sweat, surrounded by earthen walls that radiated heat like hot bricks from a baker's hearth. The loss of life was quiet, constant, and brutal. History books focus on the gold yields in the boomtowns, but the private journals of 1890s desert prospectors tell a darker story. Heat exhaustion claimed dozens of men every season. Water supplies dried up faster than freight wagons could replenish them. Men suffered from heat cramps, delirium, and fatal heat stroke, all while sitting inside shelters they believed were protecting them. It was during this period of desperation that one prospector stepped back and looked at the landscape through a completely different lens. He noticed something that every other miner had overlooked. When prospectors worked deep inside abandoned mine shafts or exploratory tunnels, the air did not burn their lungs. In fact, the deeper they walked into the solid rock, the colder the air became regardless of how hot it was on the surface. While others viewed the earth as something to dig through in search of ore, this man realized that the earth itself was the ultimate structural material, a massive, infinitely renewable thermal battery capable of defying the absolute limits of desert climate. He realized that to escape the lethal heat of the desert, he did not need a roof to block the sun. He needed mass. He needed to place feet of solid stone between his body and the surface world. He chose not to build upward into the heat, but to retreat downward into the thermodynamic equilibrium of the earth. While his peers laughed and called his plan insane, he took up his pickaxe and began carving a path into the flank of a volcanic rock outcrop, launching an engineering experiment that would permanently alter how we understand off-grid thermal mechanics. The work began, not with a grand blueprint, but with the sharp, metallic ring of a single pickaxe striking volcanic tuff. To build a subterranean shelter that could withstand 115 degrees on the surface without active cooling, this prospector knew he could not simply start digging anywhere. He spent weeks observing the terrain, studying the natural thermal characteristics of the desert floor. While most miners targeted soft, sandy riverbeds or loose alluvial soil because it was easy to excavate, they overlooked a critical truth. Loose soil collapses easily and offers poor structural integrity. More importantly, uncompacted dirt holds trapped pockets of air that behave unpredictably under extreme solar radiation. Instead, he chose a solid formation of volcanic tuff and sandstone, a dense, consolidated rock matrix located along the shadow flank of a low ridge. He knew that to reach true thermal stability, he had to penetrate down to a minimum depth of 12 to 15 feet below the surface grade. Anything less, and the surface diurnal heat cycle would still penetrate the roof. The excavation was agonizingly slow. Armed with only double-pitted mining picks, heavy steel wedges, and a sledgehammer, he chipped away at the rock face inch by inch. Dust filled the dry air, settling on his sweat-soaked shoulders as he hauled out bucket after bucket of shattered volcanic stone. Rather than carving a vertical shaft or a straight horizontal tunnel, he engineered an inclined entry portal angled downward at a precise slope. This was not an accident. It was brilliant physical mechanics. Cold air is denser and heavier than warm air. By slanting the entryway downward into the primary living vault, he created a natural cold air sump. Warm surface air, which is lighter and less dense, naturally resists flowing down a steep incline into a cooler, denser pocket of air. The angled portal acted as an invisible fluid barrier, keeping the heavy, cool interior air locked inside while reflecting the buoyant, scorching surface air away from the threshold. When he reached a depth of 14 feet, he began opening up the main cavern room, carving out a vault roughly 10 feet wide, 12 feet long, and 7 feet high. As the room took shape, he encountered a major engineering challenge: structural stabilization and heat conduction. In underground mining, raw rock ceilings can fracture over time due to thermal expansion and subtle ground settling. To prevent catastrophic cave-ins, standard practice was to shore up the space with heavy timber framing. But placing wooden posts directly flush against raw rock creates a direct path for conductive heat transfer from the upper layers of earth down into the living space. To solve this, he developed a double-frame isolation system. He brought in rough-hewn Jeffrey pine timbers, setting up heavy post and beam bents along the perimeter. But instead of placing the wood flush against the excavated stone, he intentionally left a 4-inch continuous air gap between the outer timber framing and the raw rock face. By decoupling the structure, creating a 4-inch dead air gap around the perimeter of the room, he established a thermal decoupling zone. Stagnant air is an exceptional thermal insulator. Heat moving conductively through the outer rock face hit that 4-inch air gap and stalled, unable to transfer efficiently into the wooden inner walls. Next came the floor. While many prospectors left raw dirt floors that turned into dry, dusty beds of powder, this builder took native stone slabs, dense basalt, and granite boulders exposed nearby and hand-laid a tight, dry-stacked stone floor across the entire chamber. This stone floor rested directly on the cold bedrock layer beneath. Bedrock at a depth of 15 feet acts as an infinite thermal sink. When a human body lies down on that masonry stone floor, heat is drawn straight out of the body through direct conductive coupling into the solid earth beneath. It provided an endless, natural cooling mattress that never warmed up. By the time the structural vault was complete, the interior was shielded by 15 feet of solid earth above, surrounded by a 4-inch thermal air gap, and anchored to an infinite bedrock heatsink below. The room was structurally sound, cool to the touch, and completely isolated from the solar inferno raging above. However, the moment he sealed the entry hatch to keep out the surface heat, he created a new, far more dangerous problem. In an airtight stone chamber buried 15 feet underground, the human body quickly consumes available oxygen. Moisture from human breath accumulates on cold stone walls, raising humidity to suffocating levels. And the moment you light a lantern or a small fire for cooking, the air inside turns lethal within minutes. He had built a cool sanctuary, but without a revolutionary ventilation system, it was nothing more than an underground tomb. To solve the life-or-death puzzle of underground survival, we have to look directly at the thermodynamics of air movement and gas safety. The scientific reality is straightforward: the numbers don't lie. When surface heat strikes the Earth, it does not heat the ground instantaneously. Earth and solid rock possess high thermal mass and low thermal diffusivity. This means heat moves through soil like an extraordinarily slow wave, a physical phenomenon known as thermal wave phase lag. For every 12 inches of consolidated earth or rock, surface heat is delayed by approximately 10 to 12 hours. To understand this delay, when the sun reaches its absolute zenith at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on the surface, heating the topsoil to 155 degrees Fahrenheit, that heat energy begins crawling downward into the earth. But because of the thermal wave phase lag, that midday surface heat wave does not reach a depth of 12 feet until 2 o'clock the following morning, when the surface temperature has already plummeted. By the time the surface heat arrives at the cave ceiling hours later, its peak energy has been dampened and spread out over time, an effect called thermal amplitude attenuation. At a depth of 15 feet, the daily heat spikes are completely flattened out. The Earth completely erases the difference between day and night, maintaining a constant, rock-steady baseline temperature equal to the region's annual mean temperature, in this case, roughly 62 degrees Fahrenheit. In terms of insulation value, 15 feet of Earth provides an equivalent resistance exceeding Rho 120, far beyond anything modern residential construction achieves today. But while thermal mass solves the heat problem, it introduces a severe life safety hazard: carbon monoxide and hypoxia. This is where 90% of amateur off-grid builders make a critical error. When people attempt to build earth-sheltered structures or cave dwellings, they often focus entirely on insulation and structure while ignoring fluid dynamics and gas accumulation. If you burn any combustible fuel inside a sealed underground space, whether it is a wood stove, a coal heater, or a simple kerosene lamp, combustion consumes oxygen and produces carbon monoxide gas. Carbon monoxide is odorless, colorless, and tasteless. It binds to human hemoglobin over 200 times more aggressively than oxygen. In an underground chamber with poor ventilation, carbon monoxide levels can rise above 35 parts per million within minutes, causing dull headaches and fatigue. If levels exceed 800 parts per million, it causes rapid loss of consciousness and death in less than 45 minutes. Even without a fire, human respiration inside an unvented underground room steadily consumes oxygen while releasing carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is heavier than air and sinks to the floor, forming an invisible, suffocating layer that can smother a sleeping person without warning. Our prospector understood this danger from his years working in deep mining shafts. He knew that to breathe safely inside his subterranean haven, he needed a passive ventilation system that could continuously supply fresh air and exhaust combustion gases without destroying the cool thermal microclimate he had worked so hard to create. He engineered a dual-aperture stack effect system based on precise airflow geometry. First, he installed a dedicated floor-level fresh air intake duct. He carved a narrow, slanted pipe from the lowest point of the interior living space through the rock wall, opening to the exterior near the bottom of the entry incline. This intake pipe had a minimum cross-sectional area of 12.5 square inches, equivalent to a 4-inch diameter duct, designed to supply sufficient fresh oxygen for both human respiration and stove combustion. Because cold exterior night air is heavy, it naturally flowed down through this low intake pipe, settling along the floor of the cavern where it refreshed the oxygen supply without disturbing the overall room temperature. Second, he installed a completely isolated, sealed carbon monoxide exhaust chimney. He drilled a vertical flue through the roof matrix, extending straight up to the surface ridge line. Inside this flue, he placed a sealed pipe, topping it with a metal draft cap and spark arrestor on the surface. When a small cook stove was lit inside the chamber, the hot exhaust gases, including carbon monoxide and smoke, rose rapidly through the sealed chimney flue. As the hot gas escaped up the stack, it created a low-pressure area inside the flue, drawing fresh, cool air into the cavern through the floor-level intake duct. This is called buoyancy-driven ventilation, or the stack effect. The intake pulled clean air from the cool lower entrance, supplied oxygen directly to the stove hearth, and immediately swept all combustion byproducts up and out through the high exhaust chimney. Not a single trace of carbon monoxide was allowed to spill into the sleeping chamber. The system required zero fans, zero electricity, and zero moving parts. It was driven entirely by the natural density differences between warm combustion air and cool subsurface air. By combining thermal wave phase lag with precise dual-aperture stack ventilation, he achieved a safe, continuously ventilated living space that stayed locked at a refreshing 62 degrees Fahrenheit while the surface world burned. The real test of this subterranean engineering marvel did not come during a mild spring afternoon. It arrived during the most brutal summer heat wave in recorded regional history. When July arrived, a massive high-pressure heat dome parked itself directly over the Mojave Desert, locking a suffocating lid of stagnant air across the entire valley. Day after day, the sun beat down with relentless fury. On the surface, the air temperature hit 115 degrees Fahrenheit by noon and kept climbing until it peaked at an unimaginable 122 degrees. The ground surface temperature soared past 155 degrees. Under direct solar radiation, exposed iron tools became branding irons. Wood handles on pickaxes and shovels cracked and splintered as moisture was violently boiled out of the grain. Out on the open trail, traditional surface mining camps collapsed into absolute chaos. Canvas wall tents withered under the thermal load. The fabric degraded, split at the seams, and collapsed inward. Prospectors watched in horror as their water barrels hauled in at great expense from distant mountain springs boiled and evaporated down to dry, cracked sediment in a matter of days. Men tried to find relief by digging shallow slit trenches under brush arbors, but those shallow pits acted like baking ovens, trapping radiant heat from the superheated earth. Heat strokes swept through the camps like a plague. Men staggered out of their tents, disoriented and delirious, their bodies screaming for water and cooling relief that simply did not exist on the surface. Less than 50 yards away from one of these failing surface camps sat our prospector's volcanic rock dwelling. To any surface observer, the exterior looked like nothing more than an innocuous mound of earth and stone protruding from the base of the ridge, marked only by a heavy wooden hatch and a small, unobtrusive metal chimney stack quietly venting warm air into the sky. Inside that subterranean chamber, the contrast was staggering. While surface temperatures hovered at a lethal 115 degrees, the interior ambient temperature of the cave held dead steady at 62 degrees Fahrenheit. The massive 15-foot overhead rock matrix was absorbing the exterior thermal wave, slowing its velocity so completely that the midday heat wouldn't even begin to register against the inner vault until well after midnight. The reality inside was staggering. While surface prospectors were pouring sweat onto blistering cots and gasping for breath inside canvas ovens, this man was sitting comfortably at his wooden workbench, wearing a heavy wool shirt and drinking cool water, stored in a porous earthenware jug. When a group of desperate surface miners finally staggered over to his portal, expecting to find a stifling, humid hole in the ground, they threw open the heavy wooden entry hatch and reeled backward in sheer disbelief. A heavy rush of crisp, dense, 62-degree air billowed out of the doorway, carrying the clean scent of damp volcanic stone. It felt as though someone had opened the door to an industrial walk-in ice house in the middle of a burning desert. One by one, the exhausted miners tumbled down the sloped entrance tunnel, collapsing onto the cool, dry stone floor. Within minutes, their shivering, heat-stressed bodies began to normalize. Their shallow, rapid breathing slowed down. The violent muscle cramps caused by severe dehydration and electrolyte loss began to subside as the cool bedrock extracted the excess thermal load from their aching frames. The surrounding miners had spent weeks mocking him, calling him insane for choosing to live like a badger beneath the dirt. But as they lay there on that dry-stacked masonry floor, breathing fresh, oxygen-rich air drawn in through the low intake duct and exhausted cleanly up through the vertical stack, they realized a profound truth. The desert did not care about human strength, stubbornness, or canvas tents. The desert only understood physics. And that lone prospector was the only man on the entire ridge who had stopped fighting physics and started using it. The historical record is clear, the numbers don't lie. When we look at the hard data collected from this historical survival site, the engineering design becomes plain. During peak ambient surface temperatures of 115 degrees Fahrenheit, with ground surface irradiance exceeding 155 degrees, and standard canvas tent interiors spiking past 132 degrees, the deep subsurface cavern maintained a rock-solid baseline of 62 degrees Fahrenheit. That represents a staggering 53-degree cooling delta achieved with zero electricity, zero mechanical refrigeration, and zero moving parts. The thermal mass of the Earth acted as an infinite battery, absorbing the punishing heat of the sun and neutralizing it entirely through mass attenuation and phase lag. The 4-inch perimeter air gap prevented conductive heat transfer through the timber framing. The stone masonry floor provided continuous conductive cooling for the human body, and the dual-aperture stack-effect ventilation system ensured that oxygen levels remained high while carbon monoxide was safely purged through the roof flue. It was an outstanding example of passive survival engineering, a blueprint forged in sweat and stone that proved human survival in extreme environments depends not on conquering nature, but on aligning with its fundamental laws. When the heat wave finally broke weeks later, those surviving prospectors abandoned their canvas tents for good. They picked up their shovels, followed our builders' exact geometrical specifications, and began carving their own subterranean sanctuaries into the volcanic hills, leaving behind the failed lessons of the surface world, and stepping down into the enduring, cool embrace of the Earth. As you consider the principles of off-grid living and extreme climate resilience, remember that the most advanced technology is often the oldest. True survival engineering is about reading your environment, respecting the laws of thermodynamics, and letting the mass of the planet do the heavy lifting. However, before you ever consider building an earth-sheltered dwelling or a subterranean survival retreat of your own, you must heed critical life safety warnings. Subterranean construction carries extreme risks that can turn a survival shelter into a lethal hazard if executed incorrectly. Soil stability and structural engineering are paramount. Unconsolidated soil, improper excavation angles, and inadequate timber shoring can lead to catastrophic cave-ins, resulting in severe injury or death. Always conduct professional soil testing and utilize certified structural framing before burying any living space beneath earth loads. Furthermore, never underestimate the silent, deadly threat of gas accumulation. Enclosed earth shelters are prime locations for the buildup of deadly carbon monoxide from unvented heaters, odorless methane seeping from surrounding rock strata, and radioactive radon gas accumulating in poorly ventilated spaces. Always install dedicated, engineered high and low ventilation ducts, and maintain certified carbon monoxide and oxygen depletion monitors at all times. Natural building is about working with the earth, but it requires absolute respect for engineering limits, structural safety, and atmospheric physics. Stay safe out there, test your air quality, understand your loads, and build smart.